Conspirituality listeners. This will be an open video letter response to Jay Brown, as you may be able to tell from the title. I'll do my best to handle it without Kenobi behind me. Maybe at some point he'll jump up on that couch because I know people miss him when he's not there. So first of all, Jay, hi, I'm Julian. We don't know one another, but I'm very aware of you and of your work, and I have several friends and colleagues who I love and respect who have been on your podcast. Overall, the impression I've formed of you is that you are a genuine, smart, curious person who's not afraid to say the unpopular thing and to break new ground and to, really ask good questions and get into interesting conversations. So I salute you in that regard. And I want to say too, well, first of all, this is a response to your episode from February 15th. And doesn't matter what the episode's about because what you do in your introduction is really what I'm responding to. And it's that introduction about the pandemic that I wanted to respond to here, just in the interest of having a nuanced conversation. So let's see. I want to say up front that I'm with you. I identify. I'm a dad too. I empathize. My daughter is younger than yours, so we're not having to deal with like a homeschooling thing or anything like that. She's barely left the home. She's just gone to the beach and to the park and things like that. In her short life, she's almost 3. But it is upsetting that she's not getting to have the socialization experiences that we wish she was right now, for example, that we can't go everywhere, that we can't have friends come over, that she can't be interacting with other kids and just enjoying that aspect of life as well. And it's been hard for us too, to be, as it is for everyone, right, to be dealing with quarantine and lockdown and loss of income and, just the discomfort of having to be in the world under these conditions and follow quarantine requirements. So I'm with you, man. It's rough. It's really rough, and we all want it to be over as soon as possible, for sure. What I wanted to discuss a little bit is how you get into this whole topic, and you said you're enraged. Am I going to wait? I'm going to wait 2 weeks and do it then, or do I do it now? Do I just say it because I'm filled with rage? I think is what you said. Correct me if I misheard. And then you go into it, and the way that you start is you say, I don't think we're being told the truth about the pandemic. And I'll play the clip here.
Am I going to say this? Oh, I wasn't going to. I was going to wait. You see, I recorded a conversation that you're going to hear in 2 weeks if you stick around or if you come back in 2 weeks. And I was going to wait till then, but fuck it. I'm going to go ahead and say it because it's pressing. There's too much kind of rage in me to not just say this out loud, which is, I don't believe that we are being told the truth about the pandemic. There you go. I said it. I don't think we're being told the truth. I'm not going to guess as to who's pulling the levers of power or how much of it is something that's planned or nefarious or how much of it is just like disaster capitalism. I don't know. I'm not going to guess to any of that. But what we're being told just doesn't add up.
Who's pulling the levers of power? I'm not going to speculate about who's pulling the levers of power, but I don't think we're being told the truth. And what we're being told just doesn't add up. So whether or not you intend it to come across this way, the way you're framing the question is already within a kind of conspiracist framework, right? You're already saying, you're postulating there are people behind the scenes that we don't know who they are. I'm not even going to speculate. They're pulling the levers. They're telling us things that are not the truth. It doesn't add up. There's something going on, right? And I have no doubt this is absolutely sincere and this is how you feel about it. But it's already coming from the place that there is a mysterious, hidden agenda and secret people behind the scenes who are pulling the wool over our eyes. And this plays to your large audience in a way that seems to validate any number of different conspiracy theories that are out there that fill in the gaps of that way of framing it in a conspiratorial sort of mindset. So I just wanted to say that as a critique, for whatever that's worth.
I am really reading a very wide, diverse sources of information. I'm reading people I completely disagree with, people I agree with. I'm reading actual peer-reviewed studies. I've been trying to look at actual data and see if I could see what's really there, even though I can't always understand what I'm looking at.
Okay, so where you go next is you talk about reading the New York Times. And first of all, you say you're looking at a wide variety of different sources, which I applaud you for. And you're even looking at people who you don't agree with. And then you talk about gain of function research. And it sounds like you've been listening to Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein on the Dark Horse podcast, because they've been talking about a lot of this kind of stuff recently. And we critiqued their appearance on Bill Maher here on the podcast a couple weeks ago. And so the gain of function research stuff, you say that people should go and read about it if they're interested, because it's really fascinating. I agree with you, it is really fascinating. Here's Kenobi, he's back. I don't know if you put it in your show notes, I don't see it, but it may be there somewhere, I'm just not seeing it. But the place to look for anyone who is watching this, who wants to go into that question a little bit further, is New York Magazine has, I think, really the definitive article on this that really goes into great detail about the argument for the lab escape hypothesis, which is what you're talking about, and the possibility that gain of function research may have been conducted in the Wuhan lab, where basically they're tinkering with the genetic code of different viruses to see what can happen with them and to see if they're actually a risk and to figure out how to beat them before that happens naturally. And that this is a very controversial area of science, and a lot of people think that it shouldn't be allowed. Now, there's no evidence that that was actually happening at the Wuhan lab, but is it possible? Yeah. Is it possible that the virus escaped from the lab while they were doing research? Yes. Might it further be possible that the virus was somehow created in the lab and then escaped? Maybe, but less likely. Is it possible that it's a bioweapon that was deliberately created by the Chinese and they're covering it up? And that maybe they wanted it to spread through the world like this to advance their own agenda? Again, I think highly unlikely. Those are escalating levels of sort of extraordinary claims that seem extraordinarily unlikely the more they escalate, right? But some of this might be open to debate. And so for quite some time, since the beginning of the pandemic, the scientific consensus has been that it was highly unlikely that the virus escaped from the lab. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It means it's been seen to be highly unlikely. Maybe that's shifted a little bit in the direction of it potentially being a likely possibility based on newer discoveries, and that's what this New York Magazine article looks at. The strong argument against it having been created deliberately in a lab is that the genetic variation that leads to SARS-CoV-2 is so random and so distributed across multiple different genes that the likelihood of it having been artificially mutated in that particular way seems very, very low. It doesn't look the way a virus would look if it had been designed and engineered to deliberately start to have those gain of function capabilities that you would do in the process of that kind of scientific research. So that's a pretty strong argument against it. Then you go to the place of like, oh, so maybe they engineered it to look like it hadn't been engineered. They deliberately went to all the extra trouble to do that. And then, you're in the realm of like, is that possible? Yes, but it seems highly unlikely and there's no evidence for it, right? So there's all of that, a little bit of unpacking on the lab escape hypothesis thing, but again, I recommend that people go and read that article. I'm sure you've read it, Jay, in New York Magazine, the lab escape. It's either lab escape hypothesis or lab escape theory, but check it out. That's the article that Brett and Heather are referring to on the Dark Horse podcast, and yeah, that may be somewhat of an open question, right? Even if 5 or 10% of experts in the scientific field think that it could be the case, well, then it's an open question, yeah? But here's where you go. You talk about the New York Times as presenting one point of view, and then 3 days later presenting something that seems to conflict with that. And so I'll play that clip right here.
3 days ago, there was this big article in the New York Times, and it was about how the team of scientists from the WHO went to China to find out what are like the origins of the virus. That seems to me to be an important thing to know. Like, how did this happen? Where did it come from? How do we prevent it from happening again? You know, it'd be a very logical question that we would want to get to the bottom to. And it's a year now since we've been in lockdowns. And this article said, coronavirus unlikely to have leaked from China lab. And if you're someone like me who's done a bunch of reading, maybe you read about gain of function research. And if you haven't heard of that, I encourage you to go read up on it some, because there's some really, I think, pertinent, interesting things there. And it seems to me a reasonable theory. But this article basically said that because there wasn't an outbreak in the lab and because there's so many protocols in the lab, you know, to be safe, that it's unlikely. And therefore, we shouldn't bother looking into it because it's unlikely. And I thought, oh, okay, well, that was a clear article that was basically saying to all of us out there who were wondering, myself included, is it possible that this thing got leaked accidentally out of a lab through some gain of function research that got banned in the United States in 2017 for a reason? Well, apparently, the New York Times was dispelling us of that myth. Although you got to be careful because they use the word unlikely. And then today, 3 days later, I saw another article. It wasn't right there at the top with the big headline. It was much farther down, smaller headline. And it says, China refused to hand over important data to the WHO team that would have provided key information as to the origins of the virus. So some of these scientists who went there to figure out where this all comes from say that they were not given data that they needed that would have given them key information. So if they didn't get the data, they didn't get the key information, why are we ruling anything out? It just seems to me like if we can't trust the New York Times, which everybody seems to be taking their cues from, we have to question all of it.
Now, your conclusion, based on these two different articles, one of which says that it's highly unlikely that the group went and they did their research in Wuhan and they came back and said it's highly unlikely that it originated in the lab. It probably originated in the wild and spread naturally. One article said that. The second article said that there was key information that the Chinese authorities may have withheld, which could be really important in terms of making that judgment. And that's disturbing, right? That is a potentially game-changing set of facts that might be hidden from view. And the Chinese authorities should not be doing that. And yeah, it's an important story. And your conclusion then is because both of these stories appeared in the New York Times, we can't trust them. That's your first conclusion. We can't trust them. If we can't trust the New York Times. And I want to suggest to you that in fact, the opposite might be true. It might be true that a trustworthy journalistic source would publish stories with apparent contradictions or stories that give different angles on the same topic because they have journalistic integrity. It's possible that a trustworthy journalistic source would actually follow the unfolding process of a story through its twists and turns, even when something that may be discovered later would contradict something that was printed earlier. And then they would print a retraction, or they would print a correction, or they would make reference back to that earlier story and say, we used to think this because of this, this, and this, but now it looks like the facts, the truth of what's really going on in the world is this, this, and this, based on this evidence, based on these arguments, based on consulting with these different experts, right? So I don't think it means you can't trust the New York Times, first of all. Second of all, the next place you go is, therefore, we can't trust any of it, right? And again, this is a reference back to what I said before about a conspiratorial framework. Generally, in conspiracy-style reasoning, there's one of the things that happens is there's generalizing from specific to global. right? So if you find one thing that doesn't seem to add up, if you find one apparent contradiction within sources, if you find one aspect of the science that seems like it might be shaky, or maybe there's conflicting evidence and there's a debate, that means the whole thing now has to be suspect, right? I become suspicious about the whole based on something that I found that was particular. One of the characteristics of conspiracy style thinking is that if one is open to a certain conspiracy, it's more likely they'll be open to other conspiracies, because there's a kind of internal logic, there's a kind of rhyming, if you will, there's a shared vibrational frequency that goes on with that kind of reasoning that goes, well, if this, then this, then this. So for example, when 9/11 happened, I always use this example, when 9/11 happened, I had friends who said, I don't trust the mainstream narrative, I think it was an inside job, look at JFK. So if JFK looks suspect to me, right, and maybe it does, that means 9/11 could be suspect too. And I understand the way that reasoning works and I'm sympathetic to it, but actually if you're really being careful in how you think about these things, the two have nothing to do with one another. Now they're under the bigger heading of like governments lie, okay, but that recognition that governments sometimes lie should lead us to want to find out the truth more so than to just assume they're lying and then generalize that everything is lies or everything can't be trusted. So for whatever that may be worth. Something similar is people might talk about, like, doctors 80 years ago said that smoking was good for you, right? So how can you trust them with regard to the vaccines? Well, yeah, we've come a long way since 80 years ago. And what do the two things have to do with one another? And this straw man of people who just blindly, not that you made the straw man, but I'm just talking about the general way of thinking, that people just blindly trust doctors with whatever. And so, and then the straw man of the doctor as someone who would tell you, no doctor today is going to tell you that smoking is healthy. And that's really important in terms of how far we've come. Doctors today are going on the best scientific evidence that is available right now. And yeah, there is corruption, and corruption needs to be rooted out and exposed and reformed. But it doesn't mean you can't trust the entire medical establishment, right? Like if I go in to see the dentist and he says we need to do a root canal, should I immediately go, well, I don't know, what does this mean, and is this really true? I mean, maybe I get a second opinion, but you know what I mean? Like there's a sense of proportionality and a sense of specificity that's necessary, that a default kind of conspiracy reaction to something doesn't allow for. It tends to just get very generalized. So next, Jay, you start to talk about the vaccines. And I want to roll this clip because this is something we need to talk about. It's something I want to talk about.
And I'll just say this, I don't understand why everybody's so excited about the vaccine. I'm sorry, maybe there's a bunch of you right now who are like getting upset now, and you're thinking, why is Jay saying this? He's being so irresponsible. We all need to stay inside, wear our masks, and get vaccinated if we want to get back to our normal lives. And I'm just questioning whether that is true. And I think it's okay to question whether it's true. Because from what I can read, the vaccine won't keep me from getting it. It won't prevent me from giving it to others. What it is said to do is be 95% effective, which some people debate, but let's give it the benefit of doubt. 95% effective in reducing my chances of having extreme symptoms. Now, that sounds actually pretty important, I don't want the extreme symptoms. None of us do.
So as part of the discussion of vaccines, one of the things you say is that it, I forget the exact language it would have just played, but the possibility, it reduces the possibility of maybe, like, there's all these caveats in there, right? And what I want to point out to you is that in academic circles, in scientific circles, and in journalistic circles, those kinds of caveats are the norm. They're sort of a convention. And actually, it's something that I think we should applaud, right? It's a level of caution about absolutist statements. And it's basically saying that, it's saying what the science does show, and it's not overstating it. But that desire not to overstate is based on an abundance of caution. It doesn't mean that they're hedging their bets. It doesn't mean that they are saying something kind of wishy-washy. And this is very tricky because in other domains, in public speaking or marketing or gaining influence and being persuasive, there's a lot of encouragement to make bold, definitive statements. And I think we're kind of in a little bit of that sort of subculture where that's part of what we're conditioned to value or to trust or to feel like we should be doing if we want to somehow differentiate ourselves or find our niche or come across as having expertise, right? In these domains of expertise, there is this caution in terms of how the language is used. So that's really important, right? And so with regard to science and with regard to journalism, there's this sense of like, well, it really looks this way. It seems to be like this. This is reducing the possibility of this other thing happening. Further data may come in that makes us change our mind. We may further amend and adjust and nuance those sorts of statements as we learn more. Yeah. So again, I don't think that that's a good reason to be suspicious of vaccines, that they use those kinds of language, that kind of language in terms of how they talk about the efficacy. Here's what we do know. The efficacy of the vaccines, as you point out, in reducing the risk of developing really serious COVID symptoms, it's so effective that we're seeing rates come down. And the important thing about all of these quarantine measures so far, as you know, is to reduce the overload on hospitals, is to reduce the exponential spread that can happen if we don't stay home and wear masks and if we don't get vaccinated. The exponential spread that can happen where, yes, even though maybe you and I might not be at huge risk of dying, for example, we might still get long COVID. We might get a mild case or an asymptomatic case and then end up with some of the later complications, which are turning out to look pretty nasty. But that aside, even though we may not be at risk of dying within a couple months of having contracted COVID or weeks, as the exponential spread happens, the percentage of people who are of that kind of risk and who need to be hospitalized end up overloading the hospital system. They end up creating just incredible, the hospital infrastructure, the amount of money that it costs to treat them, the number of people who will then die, the number of people who will be unable to work as a result of all of this out of control contagion. It would actually be much worse. I'm pretty confident it would be much worse than what we've been going through with quarantine. So because we've been under quarantine for so long, and because quarantine has been effective to the extent that it has, and to the extent that we've been able to be true to the quarantine measures, it's very easy to go, well, this is not so bad. And this is the case with all vaccines, right? Because vaccines are so spectacularly successful, way, way more successful than quarantine has been, of course. There's all sorts of ways we can criticize quarantine measures, right? But because vaccines have been so spectacularly successful, it's very easy to be lulled into a false sense of security and think, well, do we really need them? I mean, no one has, whooping cough. People don't have diphtheria. I've never been around a kid who was dying from German measles, right? Well, yeah, because vaccines are really, really effective, and that's why you need to get them. But there isn't that urgency of actually seeing the carnage that the disease would wreak if we didn't have herd immunity. With all the diseases that vaccines have basically almost eliminated, if not completely eliminated.
And it's 95% effective in reducing my chances. Doesn't say I'm not going to have them, it just says it's going to reduce my chances, and it's 95% effective. So, hey, that's convincing. Of course, there's also like anywhere between like 40 to 80% chance that I would be asymptomatic either way,
Okay, and so then you talk about the, say, 80 to 90% effectiveness of the vaccine versus a 40 to 80% chance that you would have no symptoms anyway, right? So what's the point of all of us taking the vaccine if most of us are going to be fine anyway? Well, as you probably know, the problem with that is asymptomatic spread, that, yeah, maybe I get COVID as a result of just, I might get COVID anyway, even though I'm being careful, but if I wasn't careful and I got COVID, and then everyone around me was just not quarantining, and we start passing it around, even if a significant number of us are asymptomatic and don't get really sick, and maybe if we're lucky don't develop the long COVID complications, we're still going to be passing it to people, and we'll be passing it to people who are more vulnerable than ourselves. And that's always been the point. That's always been the point of herd immunity. The point of herd immunity is that it protects the most vulnerable within the community who either cannot get vaccinated, or who are very, very vulnerable in terms of their immune systems or their pre-existing illnesses or their age, whether they're infants or really elderly, etc. It protects them first. They're like the first layer of who's getting protected by all of us getting vaccinated. The other important thing, if you want to talk about gain of function, is that the more people have the virus within a particular population, the more the virus is able to mutate. Okay? The more we shut down the spread, the contagion, the number of people within a particular population who have it, the less it is able to mutate. It mutates very effectively the more people it's infecting and the more different opportunities it has to test out its operating system, right? So that's an important fact that I don't know that you've considered. The way to stop the more virulent, scary strains from developing is to keep reducing the number of people who are infected. And the way to do that is through the vaccines. Now, the vaccines may not be 100% effective at not getting infected at all, but the percentage that they are effective at eliminating infection is significant enough that it will keep bringing down those exponential numbers, right? So part of this is that you may be excellent at math. I'm not great at math. Most of us are not good at thinking about numbers, especially when you start getting into big numbers. And a small number of people being infected, when that grows exponentially, each step of that exponential growth, it gets into astronomical proportions quite quickly. The same is true of the number of people that you're stopping from getting serious symptoms, and then the number of people that you might be stopping from getting sick altogether. Even though those numbers might be relatively humble, right? Even though it may not be that you get the vaccine and 100% of people are 100% protected against ever getting 100% of the symptoms, right? Even though you don't have that, the small seeming, even though these vaccines are incredibly effective, like it's actually mind-blowing what the scientists have been able to do, those smaller numbers, as you multiply them outward, start to reduce the exponential threat of what COVID would do otherwise.
And the only way to know that would be through the testing. And then if you read about that shit, about the cycle thresholds and all that stuff.
Okay, so next you're talking about the testing and the cycle threshold, and this is going to be an area where I'm just going to say you've been looking too broadly. You've been reading too broadly and looking at too many different sources of information, and you've come across some sources of information that are not reputable, that, yeah, are giving you a false impression of problems with the testing.
I've listened to it. I've listened to the sensible people who say, okay, well, let's dispel the myths about the vaccine. It's safe and we know it's effective. Everybody needs to go and get it. I don't know how anybody can say that with any degree of certainty. I'm sorry. It is unquestionably true that these have never been used before, these mRNA vaccines. And yeah, they did some testing, but they didn't do all the testing they normally do because it was fast-tracked.
With regard to the safety of the vaccine and the amount of testing done on the vaccine, you're absolutely right. We cannot say with any degree of certainty what the long-term safety is of something that is new. That's baked into the definition, right? If it's a new vaccine, if it's using new technology, we don't know what the case will be 10 years from now. But as I said before, with regard to this kind of epistemology, I think it's really, really helpful to look at things that we don't know within the context of things that we do know. And so vaccines have been around for many decades now. Vaccines are the single most spectacularly successful advance in the history of medical science. They have changed the world within communities that have the infrastructure to have access to vaccines. Vaccines are if there was such a thing as a miracle, vaccines would be the miracle. Okay, vaccines are incredible, and we have lots and lots of long-term data on vaccines, and we have, even though the mRNA vaccine and the adenovirus vaccine are both either new developments or new applications for existing developments, they've been under research for decades. Both have been under research for decades. Maybe don't quote me on the mRNA. It may not be decades. It may just be a decade, but I think I think it's longer than that. I don't have that pulled up on my computer to give you the exact number of years, but they've been researched for an extensive period of time. And here's what we know about vaccines. Typically, if people are going to develop an adverse reaction to a vaccine, it happens within 30 to 45 days. This is what we've seen in the track record of vaccines across the time we've been researching them scientifically, right? So this is something that we do know in terms of looking at what we don't know. And this is the reason why the emergency authorization, whatever it is from the FDA, is 60 days. So it has to be 60 days from the time that 50% of people in the trials got given their dose. So you're waiting for that period of time to see if adverse reactions develop. And because that has not happened in any of the trials that have been done now with a few 100,000 people. And here's my daughter. Oh, my baby. So as I was saying, because in all of the trials that have been done so far, over that length of time, you haven't seen the emergence of anything problematic, the likelihood of it emerging later is extremely small based on the past research that we have. The vaccines were not rushed. There were not stages skipped over in terms of their testing. Everything was done in the right way. What allowed things to be sped up was that they were going on research that had already been in place, so they had a head start. Genetic sequencing has come a long way in the last couple decades, so they were able to move really quickly, especially with the mRNA vaccines, which were, I think, the first kinds that we saw, because they're basically just taking the genetic code and synthetically creating the code for the spike protein that your body then recognizes and creates antibodies against. They were able to develop that really, really quickly. It's not because stages were skipped. It's not because safety measures were not followed. And the other thing that sped up the development of these vaccines is just that money was made available, and there was this ability for the companies to really focus all of their resources on prioritizing development of these particular vaccines.
And you can't tell me that there are not other times in history where the mass people have been lied to about shit, DDT and all that stuff that's happened in our history. This wouldn't be the first time. So I don't really know what I'm saying. You know, I'm not telling anybody what to do. I'm not asserting anything. I don't fucking know. But this kind of onslaught is, I think, designed to make us feel confused and afraid.
Okay, so there's a couple things that you're doing right at the end here, and I just played the clip. When you say that you don't fucking know, and you say you don't know what you're saying, and you've listed the things you've listed, and you say the masses of people have been lied to in the past, again, you're playing into that conspiratorial mindset or way of communicating, whether you mean to or not. I'm not accusing you of anything. And you're making it seem like, as someone who has a lot of influence, you're making it seem like it's not possible to know. This plays into something I call freshman skepticism or extreme relativism, where there's no way of really knowing anything. And this, what I hear you actually saying is you're confused. You are doing the best you can to make sense of something really confusing. And that's true for, I think, for all of us, right? And you have come up against enough things that are conflicting that you're confused about it and you don't know, but you have a sense that we've been lied to in the past. And you have a sense that this doesn't add up. and you're connecting these different dots in a way where there's not a fleshed out picture of some grand conspiracy that you're asserting, but you are saying that it doesn't make sense, and we could be being lied to about all of it. I mean, you can't trust the New York Times, right? You hear what I'm saying? And you don't trust the vaccines for these different reasons, which I was just, sort of commenting on a little bit ago. Then you get to this point where you say that this onslaught seems designed to confuse us. And this is your climax, and this is the most conspiracy theorist sounding thing that you've said so far. It's designed to confuse us, that there is some giant disinformation campaign that is designed to confuse us and hide the truth from us and get us to submit to quarantine and staying inside and wearing masks and getting the vaccines. But really something else is going on behind the scenes, and it was created in a lab, and I'm not going to speculate about who's pulling the levers of power. Do you see when I summarize it like this, it really does start to sound like you could have a big notice board behind you with all of the pieces of yarn and the push pins connecting different things to try and create a sort of paranoid picture of what's really going on. I think that what helps is to take specific questions separately and try to get the best scientifically informed information about each question, and then put it together into a picture that may not be complete. But the way that you're just asking questions in this riff on your podcast, that I'm sure is listened to by thousands and thousands of people, you're right. It does seem irresponsible. I don't believe you're malicious. I think you're very sincere in it, but honestly, I just think it's confused. And so I wanted to put this out there. Thanks for your time.